Good afternoon. Welcome to the Montana Agriculture Experiment Station's Montana State University virtual field days. I sure apologize that we have to come to you on YouTube Live. Field days are some of the best days I get to participate as department head of the research centers. I get to visit 7 different locations around the state and interact with the producers, sitting on wagons, listening to the research just like all of you, and I learn something every day. So it is unfortunate that the pandemic is not letting us come to you live in person, but we're going to do the best you can. Really quickly, this afternoon session, we're going to talk. We have 5 new candidates or contestants on the question and answer scenario. Dr. Jessica Torian from Northwestern Ag Research Center, Dr. Tim Seipel from Land Resources and Environmental Sciences, Dr. Sam Weifels from Animal and Range Sciences and the Research Centers, Dr. Pat Carr from Central Ag Research Center, and Mr. Brent Rader, who's a new sheep extension specialist at Montana State University. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for participating in such a great thing. I'll go around the room and give you a quick minute to introduce yourselves. Let's start with Sam.
Thanks, Darren. Well, as Darren mentioned, my name is Sam Weifels. I'm originally from Northeast Oregon, actually. So I did my undergraduate and master's education at Oregon State University. So my undergrad was in rangeland ecology and management and crop and soil science. My master's is in animal science, where we looked at different beef cattle stocking densities and how that affect grazing behavior and foraging efficiency and some performance attributes. I then took a break from my education after that and went and worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service there in Oregon. So I got 5 years of working with producers and farm bill programs. Decided I hadn't had enough punishment with my education, so I went back to Montana State to pursue a PhD where I looked at grazing behavior and dormant season grazing for beef cattle under different supplementation regimes, where I measured a lot of supplement intake variables and supplementation practices, and then how that affect animal grazing distribution in the landscape.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam.
Yep.
Let's go to Tim in Bozeman.
I'm Tim Seipel. I'm a assistant research professor in the LRES and the cropland weed extension specialist for the Extension Service. My research program lately has been to really improve integrated weed management in our cropping systems in Montana, whether it's in organic systems or whether it's in conventional systems. Really trying to improve weed management because we have problems that come up. I know that Pat and Zach and those guys talked about Canada thistle or creeping thistle before being problems. And we have a lot of herbicide resistance in Montana that takes away some of our herbicide tools. So we've been trying to figure out how to integrate more continuous cropping systems, putting some cover crops in there, putting some forage crops in there, and figuring out how those impact the weeds and the other ecology of the system. So that's what I'll be talking mostly about.
Outstanding. Thanks for joining us, Tim. Brent, how about we go to you?
Well, thank you, Darren. I am the current sheep and wool specialist at Montana State University, based in the Animal and Range Sciences Department on campus there. I don't spend a lot of time in my office. I spend most of the time out in the field doing research and extension work. I'm also the supervisor of the Montana Wool Lab that's based in Bozeman, one of only 2 wool labs left in the United States. And in addition to that, I guess my background, I grew up on a multi-generational sheep, goat, cattle farming operation in Central Texas. Got my master's up here at MSU and worked for some different ranches around the state, and then spent about 15 years doing mostly prescriptive grazing research on rangeland around Montana, using mostly sheep, but some cattle and goats also. So,
Thank you, Brent. Jessica.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jessica. I am at the Northwestern Ag Research Center here, been with MSU for just over 6 years here now. My expectation here is really doing a number of research that are related to both nutrient and moisture. I'm a field crop physiologist that's looking at the non-living impact of crop production, just like as I mentioned, nutrient and water are my focuses. Another one is just 3 years ago, I became a superintendent of the Northwestern Ag Research Center. So I dabbled in a number of things. Forage is one of them. Pat is very good at convincing me to be part of that area. Thank you, Pat.
You're welcome.
And so forage is also new to me, and I used my area of specialty in the nutrient side and water management side to be able to conduct forage. And so most of it is warm season crops, alfalfa. And as I said, I just dabbled in it for the past 3 years. So I'm honored to be in this conversation now. I feel like, why am I here? But I will try my best to be part of the team, I'm guessing.
You'll do great. Thanks, Jessica. Pat.
Hi, everyone. So as Darren mentioned, I'm Pat Carr. I'm at the Central Ag Research Center. Actually got my last degree at MSU, and then we were in North Dakota State for quite a number of years. While I was there, I was a cropping systems agronomist, as I am here. And some of that had to do with evaluating forages and particularly annual forages. I think many of those who are listening today, watching today, remember Dave Wichman. Dave was a longtime superintendent here at the center. Dave had a very active annual forage program, and that's really how I got to know Dave when I was in North Dakota. We would share information intermittently. So after he retired, I felt, and our advisory board certainly supported it, that we continue annual forage research here. It fits in well with my charge as looking at ways to diversify wheat-based cropping systems.
Thanks, Pat. I'm going to go back and give some people a time to add some questions in. And I'm going to go to Tim and maybe Brent to talk about it. We had a robust discussion on cover crops and dialogue on how that may impact weed suppression and the impacts of sheep versus cattle. So either one of you want to talk about weed suppression, either with or without livestock, and some recommendations on cover crops or grazing.
I can start talking about just the weed suppression side from cover crop side. So in 2018, 2019, we followed up on the project you guys started at the Northern Ag Research Center in Havre, where you had a wheat cover crop rotation in there. And we looked at some of these different mixtures of cover crops. And there's a video up in the soil. I made it into the soil section in there because we looked at soil health too. But what we found was, yeah, there's sometimes a pretty good ding after you've had cover crops in for a long period. Your wheat yields go down. But early season cover crops, lots of biomass, I know that was mentioned before, really suppressed weeds. They suppressed the amaranths, the pigweeds, the kochias. They did a good job of suppressing weeds in there. The later season, warm season crops like millet, those things didn't kind of put on biomass early enough. So from a weed science perspective, early season cover crops with lots of biomass is how you suppress weeds.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Brent?
I think one of the major differences between grazing weeds using livestock and rangeland and a rangeland setting and a cropping setting is that one of the things we learned early on after quite a bit of experimentation, and we've been grazing rangeland weeds since Dr. Olson really started it with spurge back in the late 80s, actually at Bozeman, was we kind of learned in a rangeland system, you really need to focus on your desirable. So you want to impact the weeds as much as you can. Some of the previous discussion before lunch talked about timing, and that is one of the things that plays a big role. In a cropping system, though, you're not specifically worried about and a lot of times in a cover cropping system, you're trying to terminate that cover crop. And so you're not as worried as you are in a rangeland system with protecting those desirable species. So in a rangeland setting, say you're grazing knapweed, we know from research that you need to go in after about the 4th of July. Knapweed isn't extremely palatable to either sheep or cattle. We basically just want to remove the flowers off of the top of it. If you try and graze it too hard, they impact, say, your rough fescue or your blue bunch wheatgrass too much. And so in a rangeland setting, we really want to focus on the desirable species out there. As Darren talked in some of the discussion before lunch, there's also a big difference between class and species of livestock. So goats are very selective eaters. They basically go in and remove very specific parts of the target weed that you're after. Hit browse a lot heavier, the browse and forb species. Sheep are more of a generalist eater. They will use both browse, forbs, and grasses. And in cattle, because of the basically using their tongue to kind of pull when they eat, they tend to use mostly grass species. One interesting thing that we did have is we were looking at the impact of cattle grazing during Cyphloleonis emergence. And Cyphloleonis is a large beetle that basically eats the roots out of knapweed, is fairly well established in Western Montana. One of the interesting things we were seeing with that study versus sheep is that we were finding a lot of knapweed plants that were broken off. Sheep basically were going in, taking the buds off of the knapweed plants. The cattle were using their tongue. They were wrapping around those knapweed plants. And because the Cyphloleonis had weakened the root structure, they were basically pulling those knapweed plants up by the roots and breaking them off. So just kind of a general overview of prescriptive grazing differences between cover crop and a rangeland setting.
Great, thank you guys. Pat, this is coming in from Terry. I think that's Prairie County, if I'm doing right. Can you give us some thoughts on reducing nitrates in your annual forages, on when to cut, and any recommendations on current annual forages you've had good yields on?
Okay, sure. I think as a general rule, the later or the longer you delay cutting an annual forage, the less chance there is of nitrate problems. You know, conversely, the earlier, the greater the chance. In terms of species, and I think if you would move over into North Dakota, you'd see quite a bit more oat being grown than barley, like in Montana of the spring types. And you know, oat of the cool season annual forages tends to be most prone to nitrate, excessive levels of nitrate building up. So, you know, that is one reason I think why you see more barley being grown in the state. And I know when Dennis Cash was here and Dave, they weren't real supportive of a lot of oat being grown for that reason. Now we are growing more oat in our annual forage trial, and oat can yield fairly well, but again, it's just more susceptible to nitrate poisoning. In terms of species, you know, I'm following Dave's lead, although there's a lot of data to support it, and also the programs that we have. Phil Bruckner has been actively breeding for forage type winter wheat varieties. So Willow Creek, I think, is one that a lot of Montana farmers who do grow an annual forage are familiar with. You know, it's a winter wheat variety. Ray is a more recent release out of Phil's program, and you know, Ray is also really was bred for forager hay production. Jamie Sherman is our barley breeder, and Jamie is now actively selecting for not only good malt types, but also barley that can be grown for forage. So I would anticipate there being some pretty good barley choices, modern choices to maybe replace some of the older ones that Montana farmers and ranchers have been growing. Really old ones like Horsford, although I don't think too many grow that anymore, but Haybet, some of these other ones. I think Jamie's going to have some newer barleys that are going to be very, very competitive. And one other thing, I know I'm going a little bit longer. One thing I like about comparing Ray and Willow Creek, there's a common perception that a taller annual forage is going to yield more than a shorter annual forage. And data in Montana, and Ray and Willow Creek are a pretty good example of that, really demonstrate that is not always the case. So you can't really go with height as being a selection tool always. Ray here at the Central Ag Research Center in general has yielded at least as much, and in many cases more dry matter than Willow Creek when harvested at the same growth stage.
Outstanding. Thank you, Pat. Versus some very taller trits that are out there in the world tend to get a little more stem, a little less little less stemmy, more tillers on the Willow Creek? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, yeah, the triticales are pretty tall. You know, Dave continues to select for them. I think in general, they do yield pretty well. I mean, if you compare many of the winter triticales to the winter wheats, the triticales in general are going to yield a little bit more. Where the winter wheats win typically is quality, and that's not surprising if you know how triticale was developed and why. So, but I think, you know, a good farmer can, and a good rancher can select varieties. We can do a lot with management. Again, like I said, you know, this is one area where as a manager, you have a lot of control. Longer you delay to a point, the higher the dry matter yield's going to be in general, but you're going to sacrifice quality. So you get to decide what you want to do, not only in selecting the crop type, whether it's a triticale or a winter wheat or a spring barley or spring triticale, which we've got, but also when you want to harvest them. And that's oftentimes what it ends up being, is some kind of compromise. You can kind of live with a certain amount of tonnage, but you really want the quality, or vice versa.
In regards to weed suppression, we did some trials at Moccasin as part of a project we called Many Little Hammers. And we were looking to manage wild oat, and we were looking to manage kochia.
Now, don't promote the taller varieties.
Yeah, and we had when we had the winter triticale in there, and it had to be harvested a little bit earlier than we would have liked for getting weed suppression out of there. The spring barley, spring pea mixture, you could leave it a little longer, then cut off your kochia or wild oat that was in your field before any seed was viable, and you got pretty good reduction in seed production. Combine that with another method for terminating it then, and you got actually really nice weed suppression out of it.
So Tim and Pat, are you saying that using cover crops to control specific weeds, you may end up with a situation like we do in livestock, where we really target the class and species of livestock that's going to impact the target weed that you're trying to impact? So you might, you know, if it's a winter annual versus a summer annual versus a perennial, you might eventually come up with some recommendations on, well, we need to use this type of cover crop to specifically try and take this type of weed out. Maybe eventually that research will get there.
Yeah, I think absolutely. That's what I've been trying to start to pick at, is what cover crop can we really use to sort of hammer at kochia and be most competitive against it? Wild oat too.
Yeah, no, that's right, Brent, for sure. And I think there's some research that's already been done that supports that. And I think too, when we talk about cover crops, you know, in this context, we really need to talk about dual use crops, because they're really cover, but also forage. You know, we've got, they serve two important functions.
It's really critical, in my opinion, when we talk about cover crops, is to first establish your goal of what your cover crop is. If we're just going to throw a cover crop in the ground, it doesn't do us any good. If we're going to throw a cover crop in the ground that is going to be used for grazing or weed suppression, or I want to graze it in the fall with my calves, those are three different types of cover crops we should be planting and harvesting. So I think as we make recommendations as experts in the field or university professionals, is we need to be focusing on our producers to stop. Number one, what's your goal? How are you going to use it? And then design the cover crop behind that. So I think that's one of my big things. So I appreciate you all bringing that up. Sam, we have a question from Phillips County about how protein supplementation or energy supplementation impacts grazing in late fall or winter grazing. Do you have a question on that, or answer that question?
Sure. So there's kind of a couple questions within that question. So most of the stuff that I've done is, or I guess the first part of that question that we can talk about real quick is a protein supplement versus an energy supplement. So a lot of times when you're talking about an energy supplement, you're talking about supplementing these cattle with like a grain source or a concentrate, mostly a highly digestible carbohydrate. Protein supplementation is exactly what it sounds like, and that's where you're supplementing with a protein specific. When you're talking about late grazing or late season grazing, typically forages are deficient in protein, so you end up with getting a little bit higher bang for your buck, if you will, with your cattle's grazing. supplementing with a protein versus a energy source. So for instance, if you supplement with the energy source, you're going to end up, you can actually depress how much your cow will eat overall, where protein will actually help improve some of that. And so some of the research that we've looked at with protein supplementation and grazing behavior, we found that if you're going to do some hand feeding cake, especially daily, you might actually limit that animal, how much time that animal is going to graze per day. And you might limit its distribution, especially if you're going to be feeding that cake in the same location every day. On the flip side of that, if it's a drought year and you're pretty low on your forage availability, that cake might actually provide some additional fiber and stuff to help those cattle. The self-fed protein, loose protein and stuff like that seems to have your cows seem to distribute a little bit better across the landscape, graze a little bit longer, and so that can actually play a factor as well.
Great, thanks, Sam.
Yep.
You kind of mentioned beef cattle. Brent, is there anything different about sheep you want to comment about that question?
Well, MSU did quite a bit of sheep research, winter supplementation starting in the 50s when they acquired the Red Bluff research facility. And it culminated probably in the 90s with Dr. Cotton, Dr. Thomas summarizing a lot of that stuff. I'm sure, Darren, you remember Dr. Verl Thomas well. And they summarized all that research, and a lot of what it found on the sheep side of it was in most winters in Montana, you needed, on average, you could supplement about 33 grams of crude protein, which comes out to, I think, about half a pound of a 16% cake per head per day. A lot of times I kind of recommend going to the every other day feeding. That just puts more supplement out there. If you've got some older ewes or some younger yearling ewes mixed into that group, they're not having to fight as hard to get a bite of that protein. The last couple of winters, I would say we've been pretty deficient nutrient-wise, at least up in the northern Great Plains area. The weather, I'm sure you are well aware of, Darren and Havre, the last couple of winters have been pretty ugly. We've set all-time snow records in Shoto 2 of the last 3 years, and it's kind of showed up in our lamb crops. And so I've been recommending to everybody, I've got to write an article for a magazine that's due next week on testing hay and feeding hay, because I think we've been pretty remiss on that for the last couple of years. But in general, I agree with a lot of what Sam said on that research that's out there.
Perfect. I'm going to put a plug in. Good transition, Brent. I think that's the cheapest bill I pay every year is my forage sampling and hay sampling and tests. I can't feed it properly if I don't have those tests. And these are fields I've known for 25 years, but I can dial it in a lot better. So it's the cheapest thing I pay for is a hay test. And so great. Jessica, this is from Sanders County. They understand that you do a lot of alfalfa research. Can you talk to them about the highest, and they worded it different, so I'm going to take some liberty on the question. Can you give us the top things you've established for increasing yield and quality in your alfalfa trials at Northwestern Ag Research Center?
Sure. So thank you for that question. This has been maybe the fourth year that we've been doing alfalfa. Primarily, the reason being was, there's data out there that our fall is extending a little bit. It's warming up a bit. And so as a researcher, we want to adapt, right? So we want to make sure that we take advantage of the length of the lengthier season in the fall. And so initially we were looking at different genetics of alfalfa. In fact, we planted fall dormancy 2, fall dormancy 3, and dormancy 6. And recently we've even planted fall dormancy number 7. And these are not your typical management toolbox in alfalfa. This is something that is outside of that. Usually we plant, 2 to 4 in Montana. I'm not sure if someone is growing fall dormancy number 5. So as the numbers increasing, you have less dormant alfalfa, and then you have more dormant alfalfa. So it is very surprising, in a rain-fed environment, all of these dormancy have equal yield levels. But as soon as you provide irrigation, fall dormancy number 6 and 7 are just be yielding really high. And these are the varieties that's Cisco 2 and Magna for 7. With the caveat though that there's fall dormancy number 6 that we tested that they didn't perform very well. And in fact, it tends to be kind of somewhere down in the bottom of the rank for irrigated environment. And I think because high just alfalfa is bred for something else, for quality purposes more so than the yield, I believe. All the breeders tend to make sure that yields and quality are somewhat similar, but that's the only thing that we observe. If it's a high just type of fall dormancy number 6, it tends to not compete with the other, like Cisco 2 and Magna, which is 7. And you know, we grow Cisco 2 for 3 years now, and it's still continuously the achiever among those varieties in irrigated environment. And Magna, which is fall dormancy number 7, is continuing to yield 2 on year 2 of establishment. So we played around with, you know, nutrients and moisture regimes just so that we cover all our grounds in terms of available nutrients and moisture in alfalfa. But yeah, we are surprised. Fall dormancy 6 and 7 are continuously showing, you know, high yield in a high yielding environment like Northwestern. It's pretty good, better than other genetics that we've used in an irrigated environment.
Perfect. Thank you, Jessica. Tim, this one's in from Rudyard. They're in the hotbed of herbicide-resistant weeds, as you probably know, in that triangle area. And the question is that they're a traditional crop fallow winter wheat environment. Are you saying the integration of cover crops is going to eliminate his herbicide weeds? Or if he has escapes, won't that propagate the problem with the cover crops?
Well, this is what I say, and I was up in Phillips Valley, came over into Blaine County last week, and I was out looking a number of fields, talking to a number of producers, looking at some different things. I saw the most weed escapes in fallow, whether that was prickly lettuce or kochia. Those were the two big ones that I really saw. And then if you looked in areas where you had we looked at some test plots in Loring, for example. We were up around Loring, and then I was down in Phillips County. And when they had a hay barley planted around the test plots and cut them off, you looked in there and that kochia was small. It had just been cut off, but it was 2-3 inch kochia. You looked in the areas where there were skips in the middle of that because the drill ran out of seed. Big kochia, 8 inches, 12 inches tall in a big ball. Now, if you cut a hay barley off like that and you come back in and you apply some sort of burn down herbicide that's effective, that herbicide on the smaller weed is going to be much more effective than it is on a larger, big kochia. And I saw a lot of half burned down kochias. Is it going to solve all our herbicide resistant issues? No. But it can, adding in some sort of forage crop in there or some cover crop can really reduce the size of that kochia and give our herbicide tools that are still doing a good job on kochia more power to kill those small plants.
Thanks, Tim. And just a little bit of tag on with that question, seeing as how we've got 8 years of work here at Northern Ag Research Center for complete winter wheat cover crop or spring wheat cover crop trials. And we have to admit there is a drag on the wheat yield the next year, depending on strategic rains. If we had strategic rains at the right time, especially the winter wheat was able to compensate for not having that stored moisture from the previous crop. But if we were able to integrate livestock into that grazing component, it looked like it would be a little more profitable mechanism than a crop fallow, even with a wheat drag. And just so people are listening, Anton Beckerman and George Haynes are trying to work through that full economic analysis, so we'll have better numbers for that on you. So appreciate that, Tim.
Yep.
Pat, there's a question about fertilization and annual crops. Do you have any comments on where they should be going with that?
Well, you know, generally you're going to apply less fertilizer when you're growing that same crop for forage than you would for grain. And you still should soil test, but as a kind of a general rule, it might be like 2/3. You can back off 25, maybe even 30% of what you would typically apply in terms of nitrogen. So that is an advantage of growing a forage. The plant still plants, so it still needs the nutrients that it's going to need to maximize dry matter production, but it doesn't need as much. And you've got to be more careful because excess nitrogen is an environment you don't want if you don't want to run into nitrate problems. So it's a little trickier, but I think in general, a good rule to follow is always soil test if you can, but then back off the nitrogen rate. Still needs phosphorus, still needs the other nutrients. You need soil test to get some idea of where you're at.
Perfect.
Just
Thank
to
you.
add to Pat, that's a very good question that a lot of producers would ask, especially with, on the quality side. There's a number of hobby horse owners in the valley and even smaller ruminants. And so it becomes, the choice of forages in terms of quality is becoming really specific. And so we were funded by the Montana Fertilizer Advisory Committee this year, and we're going to conduct it in 2 years. And we conducted studies of using teff and Sudan grass, different sources of this species. And we put on like no application of nitrogen, for instance, and then a total of 75 pounds, from the residual and what you're applying. And then we increase it by 25 points. So 75, 100, 125, and 150, just so that we could document and trace, nitrate and quality and yield over time and have a better grasp of our recommendation in terms of nitrogen for these annual forages. But Pat is very much correct. We don't want to over apply nitrogen on forages. I think if you have a low input system there, forage is better option in my mind.
Perfect. Thanks,
You
Pat.
sure that
Thanks,
I'm
Jessica.
correct? Did you hear that?
Yeah, I got it. Check.
One thing I did want to add too, and it's somewhat unique to Central Montana. I never dealt with this until I moved here, but I think many farmers and ranchers know this. But around the research center in Central Montana, we do have a lot of sulfur deficient soils, and I mean it's dramatic. And Dave Wichman did, I think, some research that really demonstrated this. But that's one place where a soil test really probably isn't near as accurate as really previous crop performance. And it can be very dramatic. It looks a lot like nitrogen deficiency, where you look for the differences where that deficiency is occurring. Nitrogen moves pretty readily in a plant, sulfur doesn't. So you're going to tend to see nitrogen deficiency in older material, whereas with sulfur, you'll see it in younger material. But the only reason I bring that up is, it can be dramatic. It can be the same impact on yield as, for those of you who are familiar with growing, pick your crop, wheat or barley, where you don't apply any in. And one crop that does impact is the one that Jessica's talking about a lot. It applies is alfalfa. Yep. At the research center where we have these low sulfur soils, if we don't apply sulfur, the alfalfa simply doesn't grow. It's dramatic. So do be aware of that with soil testing. It's really not going to be a good indicator of sulfur or sulfur deficiency. And canola growers know this, but if you don't have much experience, and you see a crop not performing very well, a tissue analysis will tell you if you've got a sulfur problem or not.
Perfect. Thanks, Pat. I think this one's going to be for Brent and Sam. This is from Madison County. They're looking to get into grazing cover crops in the spring and the fall. What kind of precautions should they be worried about? I'm assuming we can go to 2 different species here, whichever guys you want to take about, and thoughts. And in my mind, when I read the question was Pat covered nitrates, but maybe prussic acid and composition of maybe, some other type of species. So you guys want to touch base on that, please?
Sure. Go ahead, Sam. Age before beauty.
All right. Yeah. One of the big things that I think you got to be aware of, and I've been working with Darren on some of this with their cover crop program that they've been doing, I think, for the last 10 years, and trying to use some of this for forage source for beef cattle. When you're picking some of these cover crops and what you're going to graze with them, there's some tricks. And so, one, if you're going to have any like annuals in there, nitrates, I would guess, would probably be the biggest problem that you want to pay attention to. One of the other things I've kind of been looking into and running to is this concept of using C3 or C4, a forage base. So warm season or cool season forages, especially in a dry land, although the C4 seems like they hold quality longer in the season. So if you're going to be grazing early summer, midsummer, the quality looks really nice. But if this is a dry land situation, I think you might be a little bit disappointed with the production, just because there's not as many growing degree days for those C4 plants to put the production. So you end up with this nice high quality. There's just not a whole lot of production there, and so you don't actually have a big forage base for those animals to eat. And then I'll defer to Brent for the rest.
Well, some of it, as you talked about, Darren, there's a couple of different reasons you put cover crops in. I live in the heart of the Greenfields Irrigation District, and this has been the malt barley capital of the world. Generally, our irrigation water runs out sometime in mid-August. One of the nice things about having the addition of a lot of people going to center pivots is, if they get that barley in early enough or cut a winter wheat crop, they can go in, blow some turnips or radishes on, get one quick turn with their pivot and get some good fall grazing. And so, as Darren said, you really have to figure out, why am I putting this cover crop in? Some of the specific differences between sheep and cattle, we generally don't tend to see as much of an impact with nitrates with either sheep or goats as we do with cattle. They tend to process those nitrates probably a little better than cattle do, within reason. Prussic acid obviously is a big issue, especially with Sudan grass. Millet does not generally have a prussic acid problem. The other issue you've really got to watch with sheep is, I think we've kind of gotten away from a buckwheat cover crop just because of the export market, but buckwheat does have a chemical in it that causes a photosynthesis reaction in whiteface sheep, and basically their heads swell up and they get a pretty nasty sunburn. And so those are probably the big issues out there that I see. You could run into with those perennial type or biennial type, say sweet clover, or some type of really obscure annual or alfalfa. I see some of those varieties out there that I really don't even know what they are. You could end up with a bloat issue there if you're not careful with it. But for the most part, if you stay away from the buckwheat and kind of monitor I'm probably getting 2 calls a week right now on whether or not people can turn sheep in on Sudan grass. And so, yep.
Yeah. I think of nitrates as an anti-nutritive compound, and it's something we have a hard time managing. I think of Sudan grass or Sudan grass, sorghum's more of a management thing. It's something, if we're managing it right, we can absorb and make that work and graze it. One of the problems I see in our trials in cover crops and late fall grazing is we may stockpile our cover crops in a windrow to be grazed later. And we get ready to graze them, and that sorghum Sudan grass is now 8 or 10 inches regrowth. And that's really the wrong time to be putting animals out on there, right after a big traumatic offense, whether it's cutting, frost, or whatever. So it's more of a management thing. It takes a whole lot more. You have to be dialed in when you're turning cattle out, because I'll tell you, the first time I heard of someone turn out on cover crops, and it was over 10 years ago. He said, I'm turning out 3 pot loads of bulls on this crop that he put in the ground. I don't know what it is, but I'm turning them out. And I said, well, 3 pot loads of bulls, let's stop and figure out, first of all, what's in the field. That's quite a bit of investment in livestock. So we have to think about that. So good comments, fellas. Thanks. Brent, the next question came in real quickly. How is the wool clip this year, and how do you see it coming out next year with the current status of the markets?
Well, for anybody, a quick overview of anybody that's not invested in the wool business, we we're coming off of historic highs in the wool market. We've never had. We had growers in 2018 and early 2019 that were selling wool for $10,000 a ton. It was probably the highest agricultural commodity produced in Montana on a per ton basis. When COVID hit last fall, basically they shut all the Chinese mills down. Now with basically everybody attending business meetings via Zoom and YouTube online, nobody really has to get dressed up anymore. And so the market for those high-end wool business attire fabrics have dried up. And so basically, other than some military contracts here in the US, our domestic wool market is dried up. We were hoping that we were going to be coming out of the COVID issue, moving into the third and fourth quarter here in the United States. Hopefully by Christmas, we're going to be seeing a major improvement. Basically the domestic buying is shut down on wool. And so we're just kind of in a wait and see. There's some good federal programs out there through the Farm Service Agency that we've been encouraging everybody to take advantage of to try and cash flow into the next year. The other issue real briefly is we just lost one of the major packing houses. Mountain States Lamb Co-op filed for Chapter 11. JBS acquired that packing house in Greeley back from them. And so that was 1/5 of the lamb harvest capacity in the United States, and probably well over half of the lambs in the northern Great Plains were harvested through that facility. And so it's going to have a major impact on the lamb market moving forward. I wish I had better news for people. Like 2020, I tell you, December of 2019, I was telling everybody 2020 is going to be the most phenomenal year in the lamb and wool industry we've ever had. And yeah, it's has not turned out that way.
So funny you say that, because someone laughed. Can everybody see my mug, right? Everybody know whose that is, right? Wile E. Coyote. I think 2020 was brought to you by the Acme Corporation.
Yeah.
So this is a quick question. I coming in, and it didn't say where it's from. Maybe Pat and Jessica, I think, can do it, but maybe it was spurred by some of Sam's comments about warm season annuals and the impacts in Montana and how you see that happening. So I don't know who wants to take a whack at it first, Jessica or Pat, on warm season forages.
I'll whack.
All right.
I'll keep my comment, short. I guess really as just an add-on to what Sam was talking about earlier. We have found some potential for warm season forages. We did a study here at Central Ag, and just in terms of dry matter production, some of them did compare pretty favorably with some of the cool season annuals. Now, this was all spring seeded stuff. We didn't have any winter annuals in there, which may be a different story. But in terms of dry matter production, they did perform relatively well, which is surprising. But again, our soils here are kind of unusual. Now, as a major caveat, we did not look at quality at all. Prussic acid, I just pretty much ignored that. So, can't comment on that. But in terms of just dry matter production, I mean, it's not true across the board, but there were some warm season annuals that did hold their own. Okay, Jessica, now tell them I'm wrong.
You are always correct, as I said.
God, don't say that.
So in our area here, we tried last year a number of things, cool season and warm season too, but we planted them around, in spring too, for both of them. We had teff and Sudan grass were in the highest in that. We only irrigated it maybe a couple of times just to have a better establishment at the vegetative stage. So our yields are close to 3 to over 3 actually in Sudan grass and teff on just, I remember 1.5 cutting, I think. And so I think here with our nitrogen study on Sudan grass and teff, I mean, they're just extremely happy, only because I think, as I said, we have good rain amount this year also, and it's a lot cooler in the spring. But mind you, the corn silage last year, it was in the range of 25 to 28 tons per acre. So, I mean, I think that's a nice number to have.
Yeah, new modern genetics have sure helped that a little bit, on the corn varieties. And we've played with teff here at Northern Ag. And the old days without the seed coat, it was kind of miserable to get good stands and good production. So I think that seed coat's helping that teff. And we had pretty good luck here also on a warm season. So we're down to about 5 or 6 minutes left to go. So I'm going to go around the room and have comments from each one of you as we wrap up today. And Pat's already waving goodbye. Or do you want to start?
I've got a question.
Okay, Pat.
The question with the animal people, and also I guess, Tim, this is directed at you. You talked about it a little bit earlier. So, there's been a lot of interest among cover crops and cover forage crops and these multi-species combinations. From an animal perspective, are there any advantages to growing, a 7 or 8 species mixture versus growing a monoculture?
I'd take a stab. I think a lot of it goes back to Darren, what you brought up. It's what is the ultimate goal? I mean, it's sometimes animals do better in a multi-species environment because they have more selection, and so they can have a little bit of preference in what they want. But if the goal is to terminate that cover crop or to target a specific weed, that cover crop mix, I've read some of the research on that, and I don't know. I think the research is still there's been no decisions made, I would say, hard and fast on whether or not a mix is more effective than a targeted single species. It seems like, from what I've read on it. And so I think a lot of it just goes back to what Darren said. What's your ultimate goal? Then if you know what species you're putting out there, then you can match your desire. If you want to terminate that crop, now do I bring in pairs? Do I bring in heifers? Do I bring in yearling ewes? Do I bring in goats to terminate that deal? We are getting a lot of requests, as you said, Pat. This research that you're conducting, and Tim and everybody else and Perry down there, word of mouth is really spreading it. I talk to a lot of sheep producers around the state and goat producers also. They're getting a lot of requests to come in and graze these cover crops off. And everybody's referring back to the research that MSU is conducting. And so I think there is a lot of interest out there, and I think we're fairly timely in that research at this time. So,
great. Tim, anything to add?
I think from a weed suppression standpoint, the more biomass you put in there, whether it's a 1 or 2 species mixture, you want the biomass in there. If you put the warm season things in there, they come on a little too late for weed suppression. You want to have cover on the ground, and you want it to be fast. How many species do you put in there? I like to say, you want something, a mustard, a grass, and maybe a legume. I don't think you need to get very complicated from my perspective on weed suppression. I will say this, we had those funny chambers out at Northern Ag, the climate chambers, for a couple years. People asked us a lot about them, where it warmed things up. One of the interesting things we saw was with the oat, vetch, mustard, sort of brassica turnip mix, when you made it warmer and drier, the oat mass went down and the brassica compensated for it. So sometimes there's some unforeseen things that happen in there when you think about having your cover crop mix. But it goes back to your goals. If you're looking for soil health, if you're looking for forage quality, if you're looking for weed suppression, you really have to define your goal straight in the beginning.
Yep. Yeah, and it looks like we must have dropped Sam on the Zoom call, so I'll jump in real quick. We only got about 2 minutes left. Beef cattle producers have very tiny margins, so I'll speak on that. Biomass is king. Give me as much as I possibly can get. Just because it's that tight. I mean, if we get it, if we get a better weed suppression than not, that's understandable. I would say the other thing, Tim, I think one thing that might help is if you're willing to do 2 burn down steps, one very early, get rid of those winter annuals that are coming in your crops, then burn it down right before you put these warm season crops in. Yeah. And don't just put a single row or a single corn crop or a low density thing. I mean, personally, I have nothing against sunflowers, but I don't think it has a business in a cover crop because it costs expensive, it's fuzzy, cattle don't like to eat it, and it doesn't do anything for weed suppression or biomass. So why not put a millet or a sorghum Sudan grasses that's going to canopy closure, get massive, get great, and there's better oil seeds like a forage canola that we can put in there that'll do a lot better job, because then push those warm seasons off. We can either windrow and stockpile and graze it late fall, because we know from previous research that those windrows are going to retain that high quality feed a lot better than standing forages, because we're going to lose leaves in that. It takes some training by your livestock to be able to do that type of windrow grazing late in winter or after it snows. The first year we tried that on our pivots here, like Brent was describing, we threw a bunch of weanling calves out with some yearlings, and they looked at it like, so there's big lumps in the field underneath snow. And finally, our operations manager had a great idea. He took our rake out there, raked 2 windrows together, and the cattle got it and realized that's where the forage was, and they just devoured it. So there's a learning phase. I think there's a really definite phase. I agree with Pat on warm season covers, depending on how much moisture you want to use and when you're going to graze it. So good question, Pat. Thank you. With that, we're going to have to wrap it up so I can get the next bunch in here. I want to make it out to the public that everybody's emails that was on here, and I apologize, Sam Weifels got dropped off, but he is available via email if you have any questions about grazing distribution. Tim, Brent, Pat, and Jessica, thanks for having us today. Their emails are also on the MSU Field Day webpage, or you can Google them on montana.edu, and they'll be happy to answer any questions. And once again, thanks for joining us this afternoon.